Hello, everyone. How are you doing? Some of you, you would have seen the marks that I posted for the test 2. If you haven't, you might want to go and check it out. But you can see this number is growing and growing. We're already in review session 6. That means we don't have much left from this semester. Only 2 more after this one, and that's it. So let's have this last push and then get ready for the exam. We still have to do the assignment for this course, and I have posted the instructions if you just want to read it and see what you are expected to produce for this assignment. There is an Excel template that you will be using to start working on your assignment, but again, you look at it, but I will post a tutorial on how to actually complete this assignment, and then I'll give you your own unique assumptions that you'll use to then make it your own. So a few highlights from the test. I must say, although some of you might not be so happy with the result, I am quite happy with how you all achieved as a class. First of all, there has been a significant increase in the average grade for the test 2 between test 1 and 2, and that is whole 2 grades up, so from 56 to over 65, that was the average. When we're looking overall, comparing the number of marks gained or lost from test 1 to test 2, 34 students have dropped the marks on test 2. 8 students had no change in their marks, so exactly same performance. And then majority of the class, that's more than half of you guys, had an improvement. So this is really good to see that you are seeing some results here, that you're progressing and that there is progress in your studies. And if we look at the average drop and average improvement, average drop was around 14 marks, whereas average increase in marks from test 1 to test 2 was 19. So students who did better, they did do a lot better than those who dropped. So don't be discouraged by your results if you are in that group of 34 students. Not all is lost. We're only talking about 15% of your grade. It's not 50% where you're just completely out of the running. It just means, well, if you didn't get, say, 30% of your test marks, well, maybe it's a difference in your final grade between an A and a B+. So it's not the end of the world. And if you are concerned, just come and talk to me, and we work on strategies, and I'll see, maybe make suggestions where you should make changes in the way you're studying. So if you're concerned, talk to me. If not, if you have seen an improvement, maybe something that you've done different between test 1 and 2, just continue doing that. Clearly, it has worked for more than half of our students in the class. Do you have any questions? You can pick up your test scripts from the assignment room later today. And you do need to bring your ID to pick them up, collect them from the center. It's on level 0 of the OGGB. We are now moving on to, well, in lecture 7, there were basics of real estate investment. But here we're now going more in depth. And in lecture 8, we learned how to evaluate and make decisions in property investment. So you have a goal, or decision that you have to make, whether or not to invest in a particular property. This investment decision is not just a snap decision. It does take time to make. And a lot of that decision is going to be based on the research that you're going to make. That research is going to kind of split into two parts. First of all, you need to understand the property you are analyzing. Just the physical property itself. You need to understand the age of the property, how many square meters it has, what its potential to be, say, is it future-proof, you know, how flexible it is in the way you can use the space in that property. So you need to really understand your property well, and what are the existing leases in your property, is there anything you need to do? Do your due diligence on that property, essentially. But then you also need to understand your market. And you know what they say about property, it's all about location, location, location. We can't go by the principle, build it and they'll come. You know, if you put the most wonderful building in a desert, nobody is going to occupy it. But so where the building is located determines whether or not you're going to invest in it. So you need to understand where it's located, what sort of tenants you can attract to your property, what length of leases are you able to secure, what is the cycle of the property market you are entering. Are you at the peak? Is it at the expansion phase? Because all of this will then influence your assumptions that you're making about your property in terms of the duration of the leases, the rental income that you'll be generating, and so on. So it's critical to understand the market of where your property is located. Once you have done your research, you need to estimate the pro forma. And this is what really the focus of this lecture 8 was, is estimating a pro forma. And really what you need to do is just really, the rest of the semester, we're going to be dealing with pro formas. So if you don't know the items that go into the pro forma, the order in which they go into the pro forma, and how you evaluate cash flows based on a pro forma, then we're really going to struggle. So, but it's quite a logical document, a pro forma. Pro forma is just really lays out your cash flows. And the goal for you is to estimate what can you extract from the property. But before you can get your hands onto those cash flows, you need to, of course, fill it with tenants who are going to pay you rental income. You ideally want to have 100% occupancy in that building. So that you start off with the revenues that the property can generate. That goes at the top. So you start off with the potential income that that property can generate. That is assuming it has 100% occupancy. You then move on to your understanding of the property market and whether or not it's realistic to assume 100% occupancy in your building. So then comes vacancy. That's where the reality of the market comes in. Once you take out the vacancy from the potential income, that gives you effective income. Between that potential and effective income, there is also miscellaneous income. And that is any sort of incomes that is in addition to the main source of income. In an income-producing property, that would be from income from your tenants. But anything that is not tenant-generated, that's miscellaneous income. For example, you can sell naming rights on your building. You can rent space for a billboard. Mobile companies like to put cell phone towers on rooftops. You can also generate nice income from that. So all of this income is miscellaneous. And then it's for you as an analyst to decide, is it affected by vacancy or not? So there is no hard and fast rule that vacancy has to come above, miscellaneous income has to be affected by vacancy. It all depends on what you're looking at. Car parks is a separate line item. It's in addition to the rental income. And again, do you allow people who are not tenants rent your car parks, or are car parks only allocated to your tenants? Then it will depend whether vacancy is taken out from the car park rental. But it is a separate line item. So you've estimated your effective gross income. That's how much the revenue that your building is generating. But you cannot just yet take that money and use it. You have to pay for things. And that is, you have to pay for while tenants are using the building, you have to maintain it, you have to pay rates to the building, you have to insure it in case there's a fire or an earthquake happens and it's destroyed. So there are costs. There, as well as revenues, there are also costs on the other side. So once you've considered that, and these costs are split into two components. There is so-called fixed charges and variable charges. Fixed charges means whether your building is 100% occupied or is completely vacant, you have to pay it. And those two things are the rates that you have to pay to your local authority and the insurance premiums. You have to pay them fully. And other operating expenses such as utilities, common area maintenance, property management fees, all of that varies with how depending on the percentage of vacancy in your building. There are differences in how those expenses are covered, but that will, of course, then affect the rent that you charge from your tenants. Of course, if you have a gross lease, you will have to put in all of the expenses that you are anticipating on that building, so it will be built into your rental rate per square meter. Whereas if you have a lease that is on a net basis, your tenants are going to be contributing towards all of the expenses on that building on a pro rata basis. So if they occupy half of the building, that tenant will contribute 50% towards operating expenses. And in that case, when you're comparing just the rental rate of a building that's on a net basis versus gross, the difference will be, at least the minimum difference will be in the level of expenses on that building. So that after you've estimated revenues and the costs, you can estimate the net operating income on that investment. Most of the real estate is leveraged, which means you would have to pay your lender as well. But debt is not considered an operating expense. Operating expenses are only those that are directly affecting your property. But leverage, it's an optional thing. Some of you might choose to just invest 100% cash and don't use any debt. Some of you might choose leverage at 100% if possible. So really, if we take two buildings, you won't even know if it's leveraged or not. Most likely it is just because most of it is leveraged. But just by looking at it, you won't be able to tell. But if somebody doesn't maintain their property, that's quite easy to tell. And it's going to have a direct effect on that property. And you can easily see that property is not maintained. That's why only expenses that directly affect the property are considered as operating expenses. Debt service is not. So once you've estimated your NOI, you take out debt service if it's a leveraged investment, and you calculate before tax cash flow. Now, these cash flows is something you can now start to play around, and this is more or less what your property is producing after you've paid off all of the expenses. Cash tax position is different from, it depends on how you set up your investment, are you just buying it as an individual? Is it a company? So we're not going to get into after-tax cash flows because you have to be an accountant and just let them deal with that. So before-tax cash flows for us is enough. So you've estimated the cash flows, and next you take it and process it and crunch the numbers to spit out and generate just a single number. From all of these dozens and dozens of cash flows, the goal is really to just come up with a single number that can be represented by an internal rate of return or a net present value or profitability index. Or you might want to just look at something on a cross-sectional basis. You might want to just calculate the yield in year 1 or in year 2 or some other ratio that you want. But really, we go through the trouble of all of this work, researching, estimating pro forma, just to come up with a really one number that we're going to use to then evaluate that investment against other properties or other alternatives. Because we do need a benchmark against which we need to set, okay, is it worth for me to go into it, or are there better opportunities for me to use this money? And so that is the cycle of how we move through the decision-making process. More or less, this would, of course, you won't base maybe 100% of your decision is not going to be based on not just one number. There is other factors, and often people are very irrational. Even though a rational person would see the IRR that this property generates, and they'll say, well, I'll definitely invest. You should definitely invest in it. Or you should definitely stay away from it. But they're still investing in it. So there are other factors that may contribute to why people made a decision to invest. But certainly, economics of investment and the financial principles would be the main drivers of that investors. So we won't get into the behavioral aspects of property investment. Now, if any of you have gone to an interview, this is what every real estate professional has on their desk. Do you know what this is? Yes, that's how they make decisions. They look into the crystal ball. Some of them have an 8 ball. They shake it. Yes. Come back later. Essentially, this is what a pro forma is. It's all based on assumptions. It's almost like looking into a crystal ball and making a prediction. And you shake it one way, and it goes one direction. Shaking it again, and it shows you another future. Why is that? And this is because this is all based on the future predictions and not hard facts. Some of it, and of course, a lot of people who are very risk averse, they want to make sure that when they're investing, as much of pro forma assumptions as possible are actually hard facts. And it is possible to have hard facts in pro forma estimation, and that is if you're investing in an asset that's already existing, it's a building that's for sale in the CBD, and it's 100% occupied with leases that are going to be that have been signed for 10 more years. More or less, it's a fact that you're going to have a building that's 100% occupied for 10 years. So in this case, it is like having a crystal ball and telling what your future is going to be with quite high certainty. If you are getting into a speculative development that is a vacant piece of land and you're going to put an office building, everything there is going to be based on your predictions and gut feeling and market it's all going to be based on assumptions. There are some kind of stops to that to balance it out, because if you are going to go and get financing from the bank, they will say you have to achieve, say, 70% pre-leasing pre-commitments on that project. So that is going to be the reality check, if you can actually get that or not into your building. But just be careful that when you're making the decisions, you are making it based on assumptions. And you need to understand what are going to be the variations in your changes in the income that the property generates, in your rental rates. You know, don't assume a 10% growth rates on the rental income when a typical market growth rental rate increase was, say, 2% historically. So suddenly, don't make assumptions that are beyond what's been experienced in the market. What are going to be your assumptions about expenses? If your property is currently 100% occupied, look at the property market cycle. Are we heading into, say, oversupply, and tenants will be having lots of choice, and they're no longer going to look at your building as the best option for them? They'll have other options, and you will not have a fully occupied building. So all of these variations in the future, you have to be very pragmatic, I guess. Don't be overly optimistic. And run several pro formas. Don't just create one pro forma. Run your numbers and just take that as the hard fact. You know, vary assumptions in your pro forma. Change. What happens if my rental rate goes from $500 per square meter to $400? Or what happens if my property is leveraged and interest rates go up from 4% to 7%? How does that affect my internal rate of return, or NPV? So vary the assumptions and see how sensitive it is to the changes into any of these three main components of the pro forma, and that is expenses, revenues, and debt. So pro forma is only going to be as good as your assumptions. They always also say GIGO, if you're familiar with this concept. It's called garbage in, garbage out. Also, it's very easy, they say, to dazzle people with numbers. And that is, you might present them with this flash model, very complicated looking model in Excel. And people might not bother to actually check your assumptions that you've made. So don't be fooled by complexity. Always check. And as I already said, we go through the trouble of estimating all of these cash flows to really evaluate this performance. And that performance is evaluated based just on the one or two numbers generated from this pro forma. Now, we can evaluate this performance on a leveraged and unleveraged basis. And leveraged means, just for most real estate investments out there, that's going to be the case. Leverage means you're going to use debt in financing. So leverage is help, yes? So with leverage, debt helps you purchase that property. Unleveraged, that means you would be using no debt. And unleveraged, your returns at the unleveraged level is something that helps you compare that with other properties, because typically if you look at other investments, those returns are going to be reported based on an unleveraged assumption. Because, you know, somebody can use debt of 80%, some of you will use debt of 70%, somebody 90%, just because of this variation in the amount of debt you're using, the interest you pay on that debt. It is going to have a significant effect on the other end, that is the effect on the internal rate of return and NPV. Whereas if you're looking purely at the unleveraged basis, that takes out any variations in debt, and it purely looks at how this property performs as it is, as just an asset unaffected by any other things. You can enhance then your return. So first look at just unleveraged basis and then see how you can enhance it with using debt in your property. Because debt, you're not doing any modifications to your property. You don't have to physically go change windows in it or repaint it. You know, it's already there. All you're doing is just go and talk to the lender and secure financing. But physically, the asset is the same. Your performance can be evaluated on cross-sectional measures, and that is in the lecture there are several ratios that you can calculate based on your annual basis, but that gives you just a snapshot in time. Whereas calculating IRR or NPV or profitability index, that takes into account the time value of money component. It takes and discounts your cash flows and put them all into the present time. And then part of this lecture we spend on talking about MIRR. And that is another way of, well, that is an alternative to using internal rate of return. Although IRR is a very popular measure, it has its own issues. So it is good for you to be aware of things that potentially can affect your decision if you're purely using internal rate of return. First of all, one of the weaknesses of IRR is the assumption it makes in the reinvestment rate. And that is all of the cash flows that are generated from the project are then reinvested at the rate of, at that IRR. So if you've calculated that your IRR for all of the cash flows that you've looked at and the IRR was 20%, that means it's based on an assumption that all of the cash flows that you received during the holding period were reinvested at that same rate of 20%. Whether that's a realistic assumption or not, you have to then decide. Again, you are making assumptions about the market and your other ways of where you can put your money, because once you've received that cash flow from your property, what are you going to do with it? You're probably going to invest it somewhere else. Can you find another place for this cash flow that will give you a 20% return? So if you cannot, this is where MIRR comes in, and it's helpful that it makes specific assumptions about the reinvestment rate. So if you can only reinvest your cash flows at 10%, then that is the explicit assumption in MIRR, that all of the cash flows that you receive are then reinvested at 10% instead of using the 20% reinvestment rate. Also looks after negative cash flows, MIRR, and that is you can make assumptions. If you have negative cash flows while you're holding this property, then in a sense you need to be prepared. What is a negative cash flow? That means that's your liability. Somehow you have to cover that hole and make it at least to a zero. So if you know that you're going to have negative cash flows, well, you need to prepare today. And maybe how can you prepare and know what is the amount of money you need in the future? Say you need to cover a hole that is $1,000 3 years from now. So you discount this to understand, okay, I can say invest $700 today and let it sit somewhere and earn a return so that by the time I need that $1,000, the 700 will grow to 1,000 by the time I need it. So again, in MIRR, you can make these assumptions. What are you going to do with negative cash flows? So how can you finance the negative cash flows, and how can you reinvest positive cash flows? And also, IRR can produce multiple rates of return if the sign of cash flows changes more than once. Typically, we want to have just one change of sign. So you've invested in property, that's one negative cash flow, which hopefully is followed by a bunch of positive cash flows that your property generates. So that is one change of sign. And that is no problem with IRR, will just produce a single rate of return. Whereas if you down the road, you experience some negative cash flows, that is already two changes in the sign. And IRR can actually produce several rates of return, which all of them are actually correct. And then how do you choose? Do you choose the highest? Do you choose the lowest? Do you average them? So MIRR, again, takes care of that because it looks only at two cash flows. It looks at the present value and it looks at the future value, and it produces just one rate of return that you can then use to evaluate your investment. So let's, do you have any questions before we move on to Kahoot? All right, so let's go to Kahoot then. I think the biggest confusion that students have when they're estimating those performance indicators such as IRR or NPV is based on whether you're asked to calculate a return based on a leveraged investment or unleveraged investment. And this is where you need to be very clear. When you're using leveraged assumptions, so you are using debt to finance your property, if you're calculating an internal rate of return, that is the return on the equity that you've put into your project. So that means the equity is the difference between what you paid for the project and minus the debt that you have on that property. That initial investment, that is the equity, is going to be followed by the cash flows that your property generates. Again, if it's assumed for the return on equity, these are the cash flows after you pay off all of the debt obligations. So while you're holding the property, it's going to be the monthly debt service that you have. So you must take from net operating income, you have to take away your debt service. So these are your cash flows from operations. Always take out debt service. And then the final cash flow, when you sell the property, don't forget to pay off the lender. And this is often the confusion that I see when students are solving the problems, is that if I ask specifically for IRR on equity, they put as their initial cash investment as the purchase price, or at the end of the holding period, they forget to take away the loan balance. So just make sure that, you know, you're always looking at the same cash flows. If it's leveraged, always take out debt from each of the cash flows. If it's unleveraged, you are not looking at debt at all, so it's purely how much the property you paid for it as if there was no debt, and how much do you sell it for, then you don't have to pay your debt, so your final cash flow is just that. And the in-between cash flows is then, again, there is no debt, so it's just revenue versus costs, operating expenses. All right, let's start. These are all going to be abbreviations, so let's see how well you're familiar with those. If you know the first item, it's easy to eliminate already some of them. So we got 40 blue as the most popular, and as I said, if you know the first one, you can already eliminate two of them. So it starts with the potential gross income, that's PGI. So we can discard the red one and the green one. As I already went over at the beginning, you take out vacancy from your fully occupied building, you arrive at the effective gross income, that's EGI. You take out the operating expenses, calculate NOI, take out debt service, calculate before tax cash flows. So most of you got the correct answer, and that is the blue one. So there is a variation of answers, but I counted, I think there is around 35 of you. So I think those who are in this classroom are all giving me the correct answers. All right. So what is the cap rate? Cap rate is a ratio between net operating income and the value of the property. So we can eliminate that it's not an IRR. IRR looks at all of the cash flows and calculates a single rate. Cap rate does not consider future income and changes in property values. It is a relationship between income and property value at a specific point in time. It's a snapshot. I can calculate cap rate for year 1, 2, 3, but I cannot look at cap rate that looks at cash flows from year 1 to 3. All right, so that, and it's not the rate that we expect to earn. So with the terminal capitalization rate approach, to determine the value of the property when we're terminating the ownership of it, so sale, for example, we still take the ratio of NOI and divide that by the cap rate to determine the value of the property. The question is which NOI you take. As I said, when you're making decisions in property investment, it's all about the future. You can look at historical data all you like, but all the value of that historical data is just to look at the trends and being able to predict what's going to happen in the future. So it's still, the focus is on the future. So any new investor coming in, they want to know, well, what is the potential of this property to generate cash flows? They're not going to care how great it was before they come in. So that's why when we're using terminal cap rate, we're looking at the year after we're intending to sell it. So it's going to be year 9. So discount rate is the rate we use to discount our cash flows that the property, all of the future cash flows that the property generates. But in investment, nothing is guaranteed, so we can discard that answer. It's not the maximum because it's potentially you can earn a greater rate of return than what you're discounting your cash flows at. So it's not the maximum. It's not a capitalized rate of return, so it's not a cap rate either. So it is expected. All of the things in investment are going based on your expectations. I noticed that I so often put N after ratio. It's just automatic when I type. So anyway, here I did it again. So when NOI equals before tax cash flows, just think about what comes between NOI and before tax cash flows. Debt service, exactly. So if NOI equals before tax cash flows, that means debt service equals 0. So you have no debt, which means it's unleveraged. How interesting. Let's look at the blue one. What is a debt coverage ratio? It is a ratio, so except that it's not the ratio of effective gross income, it's the ratio of net operating income to loan payment. And debt coverage ratio, for lenders, they lend on the property when debt coverage ratio is greater than 1. So A, they want to make sure your NOI exceeds your debt service. Otherwise, there is very room for error and variation in your cash flows. And lender wants to secure their position. They want to be comfortable with lending on it. So it is an indication of risk, therefore. So if DCR is very small, lenders need a cushion of at least 20 to 30% that will allow them, if income from property drops for any reason, either reduce rentals or increase in operating expenses, you'll still be able to cover your debt obligations. And it does concern even if loan-to-value ratios are small, which is even worse. If your debt service is very small and your debt coverage ratio is still, say, within 1.3, that means you don't generate much income even with a small debt service. Okay, so we're looking at the false answer here. So everything is true except for one. NPV, to calculate NPV, you need to use required rate of return to calculate it, so it's true. If you increase your discount rate, that will reduce the net present value. It does measure the absolute value of investment. It gives you how much extra worth you generate by investing in this project. But it's not the sum of future cash flows, it's the sum of discounted future cash flows. It has to be the present value of future cash flows minus the initial investment. So it is true. Is NPV of 0 a bad thing? No, it's not a bad thing. That means you've generated you've recovered all of the cash flows from the property that they generated at exactly the required rate of return. And in this case, when NPV is 0, the required rate of return will equal the internal rate of return. Let's just do one more question and you can go get your test scripts. So profitability index, it's a ratio. It's a ratio of everything that project generates, the present value of all of the cash flows it generates to what you have invested in it. So it cannot be 0. It can be greater than 1. It can be less than 1. That cannot be 0. All right. So we'll end our game here. Just 2 more questions. I'll show it to you later. And I'll see you next week.